So today we're going to talk about executive presence. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this, in addition to the survey that was given to this group, was an interest in talking about executive presence, is that quite often when a new coaching client will come to me, one of the things they'll want to work on is executive presence. And they'll say, my manager, my boss told me I need to work on my executive presence. And I'll ask, well, what does that mean to you? And say, well, I don't really know. I'm trying to figure that out. And so they're given this feedback to work on executive presence, and even their manager isn't really explaining what it means. And I'll often say that executive presence is one of those things that like you kind of know it when you see it, or you think you know it when you see it. But if I ask somebody to describe or define the criteria for executive presence, they kind of struggle with it. And what we want to do today is we're going to just kind of step through at least eight. I've come up with like 12 before, and I don't know that there's a definitive list. So as we go through each of these eight elements of executive presence, I'd like you to rate yourself 1 to 5. Five meaning you don't think you have any more room to improve. One means you got a long way to go. And so it's just kind of how you would scale it. After that rating, 1 to 5 for each one of these, write down one thing that you'd like to work on, one thing that you would like to improve that could be a takeaway. And you may not have a takeaway for all eight, but you could have, 3 or 4 things that you want to kind of take away. And I think the other thing is, where do you feel like you do really well? Like, where do you think is a real strength? Because I think we need to celebrate our strengths so often. Like with me, I'm always wanting to know, what do I need to improve? What do I need to work on? But it's important to celebrate your strengths and like what you're really good at and be aware of that, and leverage that. So the first is gravitas or poise under pressure. So this is where a person maintains their composure, they're confident, they're steady, and in the face of ambiguity, they deal with that really well. They're courageous when making decisions, even without complete data. So often in technology leadership, for sure, we don't have all the data, and we need to make a decision quick. And so the ability to make those decisions and to work with a team and be calm and courageous and thoughtful, just demonstrating emotional regulation with calm authority, and then signaling strength without aggression. And so you kind of get a picture here. In our coaching practice, we often talk about archetypes. And one of the archetypes we talk about is that of a king or a queen. And so, it can be helpful sometimes to, like, depending on the situation that you're in, especially if you're feeling nervous or anxious in front of a board or executives, to think about an archetype. And one archetype is a king or queen. And you can think, okay, well, how does a king or queen show up? Well, they're usually, very good posture, shoulders back, their heads up, open chest, breathing really well. They're calm, they're authoritative, they're courageous. They can be caring. They can, they signal strength, but they're not aggressive, sort of like that boldness of it. And that's something that you can hold. And we've probably all seen it at a company event or a conference when somebody walks in the room and you just like see that person. It's like, wow, that person has a lot of gravitas. I remember one time, our leadership team had the opportunity to meet with Steve Ballmer, and Steve Ballmer is a tall, big guy, and walks in the room, and like he was just filled with gravitas and poise when he entered the room. So he will often come to mind as somebody that I met. So if you can't, like, for this one, give yourself a score. What do you do well? Where do you think you have some opportunities to improve? Next is clear and compelling communication. So, a lot of times people will think about this. Somebody, when they speak, they're captivating. They speak and you're just hanging on every word. We all know that kind of speaker. I often feel that way when I listen to Satya Nadella. I mean, there's a lot of people I feel that way about. But when I listen to Satya talk, the way he talks, his demeanor, his clarity, the words he uses, I just kind of hang. And I've always felt like he's really good at that. But the clarity, simplicity, and I'm always amazed at when I see executives speak, especially like I saw that the CEO of AT&T years ago. He had no notes, and he spoke with such simplicity, easy to understand. He was speaking to the audience. If If he thought we didn't understand a term or a technology, he would explain it. Just very like caring for the audience. And I think, people with executive presence do a really nice job of being clear, easy to understand. They keep it simple, they keep it short, they're very structured. They use tone and pace, they'll pause. Um, a lot of times you won't hear them using any filler words or having ticks. We all use filler words and we have ticks, whether it's grabbing your ear or touching your nose, whatever it might be. But I think the more that we can be mindful and take care of our audience to not distract them. So the filler words and the ticks, the using jargon, things they don't understand, those are all distractions. And so we need to make it easy. So that's a big part of the clear and compelling communication part of executive presence. And then the last one I mentioned was listen and adapt to feedback in real time. And I think that's a really important one, to really be adaptive to what's going on in the conversation and to be able to respond and even pivot, and really understand the context. So if somebody else is speaking, what do they mean? And even being willing to ask for clarity and not assume what they're saying. So that's number two. Number three, authenticity and integrity. And my dad used to tell me, I remember I helped him build our house one time years ago, and we were working out in the yard, and I said something to him. He goes, "You know what? You need to say what you mean and mean what you say." And that I remember that very clearly because it triggered me to really seek to think about what I'm going to say, think about how I'm structuring what I'm going to say, and deliver it, even if it's a story or speak in a way that I'm saying what I mean. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. And that's an important aspect of executive presence. Projecting vulnerability, admitting limitations. I remember sitting in a room with Andy Taylor, who was the CEO of Enterprise Rent-A-Car at the time, and somebody asked a question. He goes, "I don't know." He goes, "I don't know. We need to find that out. Who has information on that?" And and even one year when he became the chairman, he said, "Hey, I need your help. I've never done this role before, so I'm going to be looking to you all to help me be the best chairman I can be." Moral courage, taking a stand. One of the things that we do in our coaching program is in our very first assignment on is sort of leading the self is, what is your stand? What do you stand for? Who are you? What do you believe? Why do you believe? And having the moral courage to speak up and push back and take that stand with courage to the point you're not worried about the consequence, and being bold. And I think without that, it would be difficult to have executive presence. Being consistent with words and actions, being sincere. We always talk about being sincere. Sincerity is when what you say is consistent with what you're thinking. Because if you're saying something different than what you're thinking, that can create a cognitive dissonance, and that can create an internal integrity issue that can show up physically and energetically. So again, for this one, write down how you score yourself. What do you do well? Where do you want to improve and strengthen? Four, a lot of talk always about emotional intelligence, social awareness. Executive presence about reading the room, sensing mood, tension, dynamics. When for many of us, when we grow up in technology and we're focused on the technology itself, systems design, architecture, solutions, business functions, business capabilities, there just isn't a whole lot of education or awareness around the human aspect of this. And so that's why, in our program, we talk a lot about moods and emotions, observing how to really sense where people are at. And it's just so important. And body language ties into this. We've all been in a presentation and somebody makes a face and it's like, what's that about? And being willing to even ask, "Hey, I noticed you seem to have a question," and asking with empathy and like, are you concerned about something? Being self-aware internally, being aware of our biases, our triggers, and managing conflict in a way that maintains the connection. We have a term that we use in our program. Some of the folks on here are in the program, and we talk about carefrontation. It's a little, if you read the book Radical Candor, it's a little bit like that, but I love the term carefrontation because what it means is I care about the other person and I care about their future, their concerns, their livelihood, but I am going to have a confrontation. We are going to get direct. We're going to get real. And as I care about you, we're going to have a conversation about getting real. And it actually creates a professional intimacy of sorts that builds trust and relationship and openness and working. And people that have executive presence often demonstrate that. So rate yourself on that, or strength, where you might improve. Go on to the next one. Strategic presence and vision. This one we often think about with executive presence and leadership. This is thinking bigger picture. And this one can be challenging for leaders and like technology people that are new to leadership, because we're so focused on solving the problem, getting to root cause, getting in the weeds, getting down and dirty. But executive presence is understanding, okay, I'm always aware of the strategy. I'm always aware of the big picture. I'm always linking the details up to the top, and I'm communicating that with my team. I think that the great leaders with executive presence always repeatedly make it clear, here's our vision, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, here's where we're going, here are the 5 pillars. Here's the values, and they help everybody connect to that. And I think you can be an individual contributor with executive presence and help the organization with these very principles and values. Okay, so again, rate yourself. Write down what strength and opportunity. The next executive branding and personal visibility. I've been talking a lot about this recently with uh, colleagues, network, posting, writing, and it's so important that we produce the results and the accomplishments and the outcomes. That's what we get paid, fulfilling our obligations, creating opportunities. But we have to be visible. I remember years ago, I led a team and we introduced the first Unix system into an AS400 environment. And we did a whole bunch of innovative new things, but we didn't brag about it. We just, like, let the results speak for themselves. My dad used to say, let your results be your argument. But then I realized a couple of years later, people were taking credit and getting credit for things we'd already done. And I thought, my team should have gotten more credit, and I should have gotten more credit than I did. So there's got to be a way to produce your results and be visible and be known for what you and your team are doing. And I do like the concept of never saying I. It's always we. It's our team. But when we're talking about your brand and your future, your career, you're trying to build a future to take care of your family, for yourself, for your partner, whoever it's you doing this. Yet, even though we do have a team and there's this balance with the team, but creating that. And so you'll see leaders with really strong executive presence that you can see the humility in them. You can see that they're humble, yet they stand boldly and proudly with their brand, with who they are, and it sort of aligns with their culture, and they've got stories that go along with their brand and who they are. And so I think more people than not should be really working on this. There's always the people who naturally gravitate toward bragging, and there's the people who, and I think in many ways it's the imposters that are pretending like they have the substance and getting things done, but it's all about visibility, and none of us want to be in that situation. So score yourself on that. And quite often people think of this one when they think of executive presence. They think of sort of commanding presence, body language, the way we hold ourselves. And it certainly isn't important. It's one of the 8. But it's not everything. I often talk about posture, our body, how we hold ourselves. And there's a couple aspects of this. There's how we hold ourselves physically, with our posture, with our head, with our shoulders, for the sake of the the perception that we're triggering, because that's what perception is. When people have a perception of us, they're triggered by what we look like, how we show up, what we say, what we do, our energy and our mood. But our body can trigger that. But also, if we're closed off, it affects our internal state. I mean, if we're closed off, it can affect our breathing, it can affect our mood, it can affect our emotion. Our physical body is closely interlinked with our moods and emotions, and even with our language and what we're saying. So by really holding that presence, I mentioned the king and queen archetype earlier. There's three other archetypes that we talk about that we won't go into great detail. You can always look them up, and there's different interpretations of this. So, I there's a certain school that I follow on this, but there's one archetype of king and queen. There's another one of a warrior. So it's much more of a mindset, like I'm going to attack this problem. There's another that's the lover. It's like, oh, I care, I'm compassionate. And then the fourth archetype is the magician, which is sort of like the playful, it's like a company picnic and we're all laughing and joking, or there's that time for levity. And so by thinking about these archetypes in different situations, it can like influence our body and our language and our moods and our emotions. So I'll leave it at that, but it's something that you might consider in the future. So score yourself on this one as far as how you're showing up, eye contact. I think not shown here is also dress and attire. I think this is a really, really important one, especially I think so oftentimes, I mean, I've been in technology for over 30 years, and so oftentimes people in technology sort of understate or almost have an irreverence towards dress, attire, fashion, that sort of thing. And I think the question is, for the environment you're in, what's appropriate? And I've never wanted to overdress or outshine the most senior people in the room, but I also don't want to be so far away. Like I'm not going to wear a hoodie to a board meeting where they're wearing suits. And so what is the appropriate? And the last thing I'll say on this, on the attire, is our whole life we're learning, and when we don't learn something, we seek to get help to understand it. And I always say to people, if you don't know how to dress stylistically, get help. You could go to a department store and there will be a stylist. There can be people that can help you for your body and your skin coloring and everything. Like what's the best clothing, and also how should it fit? A lot of people don't understand how it should fit. So I'll stop there, but I think that's an area, especially if you want to get into the executive ranks, it's going to be very important to be paying attention to that. So score yourself on that. And we're going to move on to the last one here, which is decisiveness and ownership. And, this is probably one of the more obvious ones, is just being decisive, making timely decisions. Nothing frustrates an organization more when it takes too long to make important decisions, and then stand by them. Not be afraid to change them if necessary, but stand by them. And then take responsibility for the outcome of the decisions made. Avoid flip-flopping. That's going to really create problems and definitely doesn't exhibit executive presence. And then, just keeping the momentum, keeping moving forward with purpose. So that's the 8. Assess yourself there. Take some notes. We could all go around and say, what do we want? Like not just like, what do we want? Like I want to retire with this much money. I want to travel the world. I want to be able to go see my kids and grandkids. Like whatever a good life is for you and what you want, it's in part why you're doing what you're doing now. I mean, you may love your work, but the fact is you're taking care of your future. And if you care about that, these things that go inside of executive presence make that easier, and it opens the door. And it's kind of, I think David kind of alluded to that. I think everybody's alluded to that, is that we want to open the door to make it to increase our chances of living the life that we want. And the thing that always puzzles me is why certain people have a irreverence, a disrespect, a resistance, a rejection to doing things that maybe they say are political, like they don't want to sell out or whatever, but you're betraying the thing you care about. And I've seen people that they've got a fine family, they've got kids, they've got, a wife and a dog, and like they've got family, and they care about that, but then some of their actions aren't taking care of that. Like their resistance to something is betraying that. And I don't want to get too deep with that, but the fact is, these things that we're talking about trigger people's perceptions, and perception is reality. And promotion decisions, compensation decisions, whether you're included into a meeting, whether you get that new opportunity, whether you get more responsibility, It's all based on people's perceptions. And this things we've been talking about today are an opportunity to trigger people's perceptions because without going too much into it, I always like to say that as human beings with our biology, if you think about like, you stand in front of the mirror, the fact is, we probably all know there's more space in your body than there is material because of the way atoms are structured, right? But if you think about like who we are as a human, we can only take in the world through our senses. Like, like we don't really see it what it is. If you study the way the eyes work and the way the ears work, like it's not what you think. It's like we're making an interpretation through our senses of what's going on. And so, and our nervous system is triggered by sounds, people, the environment, the light. And so all we're doing is reacting. And not that we manipulate people, but whenever we're interacting with them, we're triggering their nervous system. The words we use are triggering the things we say, the way we show up. And we can design that as a human being to show up in the most positive way, to trigger the most positive perception in a favorable way. And we do that with our language, with our body, with our moods, our emotions. And that all ties into this executive presence, which is kind of like, which is why it's part of what I teach and coach and practice. So anyway, was this helpful today?